So thank you very much for inviting me to your workshop, and I'm really grateful to have my contribution included into the special issue. So in this presentation, I'll basically just be going through my paper, some of the the basic questions that I'm exploring in it, and some of the findings, conclusions, and points of discussion, and then conclusions. And I'm really excited about this paper actually, because this emerged out of my doctoral research, but this was actually part of the research that didn't make it into the thesis. So I'm really glad to be able to actually then present it as a standalone piece of research here to you today, and also have it included into the special issue. So this is a really, this is quite a precious piece of work for me that, unfortunately had to come out of my thesis in the end. So it's really nice to see it actually kind of materialize here for you today. So as was mentioned, this is the title of my title of my paper is Designated Spaces for Designated Imaginaries, the Cruel Optimism of Citizen Participation in Post-Disaster State Citizen Dialogue. So a little bit of a mouthful there, but probably works better in written form. But before I go into the actual paper, I want to give you a little bit of a taste of, or kind of contextualize this research a little bit, and where does it emerge from for those unfamiliar, or maybe a little bit unfamiliar with the situation in Japan and in my research area. So this research takes place, is contextualized in the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami that took place in 2011. And majority of you probably remember the Fukushima nuclear power accident, which gained a lot of international attention. And that was kind of the international focal point of this disaster. But actually my research focuses more on the Miyagi prefecture, which is north of Fukushima prefecture, where a lot of, so Miyagi prefecture is the one that actually experienced the most devastating destruction of this disaster, primarily to its coastal communities, majority of which actually experienced up to 70% of infrastructure loss in their communities. And this image here that I've selected is probably the most illustrative of the scale of destruction, and can probably help those who are unfamiliar with the situation to actually understand the degree of devastation and also the degree of recovery need that was in this area. So in the forefront, you can see a picture from 2007 that the municipality of Minami Sanriku, which is one of the most severely hit areas in this region, had taken, and they put it on this hill overlooking the town. So this is actually taken in the same spot in 2007. And this overall picture is taken by me in late 2015, so nearly 5 years after the disaster. And you can see the kind of the scale of the destruction that took place. So all of that infrastructure is gone there. So I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was 21 meters, the tsunami that hit this town. But also what it shows you is the scale of the recovery need. So this is 5 years after the tsunami, and there's virtually nothing in this town yet. So the scale of the recovery is really immense there, and only now in 2020 and 2021 are most of the towns really kind of being able to say that yes, the recovery is kind of finished now. And to make matters worse, a majority of these communities in the Tohoku region, as it's called, have actually suffered from long-term socioeconomic decline. So depopulation, severe aging, as well as then economic decline as a result of this. So this region in particular loses a lot of population to Tokyo, because there aren't a lot of economic opportunities there, unfortunately, because of the pull of Tokyo and this kind of centralized economic system in Japan. So I was in this region for 13 months doing research, during which I did quite long interviews with a number of, with around 60 people in this, in 4 different towns, Minami Sanriku being one of them. And one of the questions that I asked from the local residents was that, what did it feel like when you actually saw your town after the disaster? And the framing that they used was a lot of the times they said like, oh, it looked like war, or it looked like we had experienced war, or it was hell, or actually nuclear destruction. So quite severe destruction that people felt. And this disaster was really disorienting to a lot of people. So there was one woman that I interviewed who was, from this town of Minami Sanriku, who said that after the disaster, she was walking in her town and she had literally no idea where she was. She had no idea what part of town she was or what should have been around her. And she said that that was quite a disturbing experience for her. And similarly, a lot of people then how they were explaining the overall atmosphere in these towns. They said that it was quite mysterious in a way, that it felt that they were kind of stuck in this landscape of destruction, but also that there was this immense energy in the air with people trying to figure out what are we supposed to do now, how are we supposed to move forward, etc. So there was this kind of sense of stuckness, but also this energy. And in the paper that I'm presenting today, I've kind of, and in my overall research overall, I've actually theorized this as, that the disaster created this heterotopian space, to use this Foucauldian term, that basically, set it apart from the familiar normalcy quite literally, actually, because a lot of towns surrounding these towns, were in a normal state and, hadn't been affected by the disaster. And also it showed that a lot of the conditions of the surrounding normalcy had actually created the conditions for this disaster to happen and impact these regions in this way. And this in turn then spurred a lot of imagination among local citizens, to seek alternatives, like how are we gonna, create a different future that's better from this declining community that we used to have. And by the time I was in Tohoku in 2015 and 16, people had started to see this disaster primarily as an opportunity to create something better. So they had, some of them had overcome a lot of their trauma already at that time, or it wasn't affecting them that deeply. So they were kind of starting to see this as an opportunity to create something better. And this is kind of the setting of my research and how my paper is actually framed as well, is that, okay, so how were they then trying to realize some of these alternative imaginaries that they had and that were quite organically coming out of this context, this heterotopian space, so to speak, that they were experiencing on a daily basis. So then I look at I look at citizen participation and sociological imagining and how those two work together in the paper. So like most post-disaster settings, Japan too witnessed a mushrooming of participatory spaces to actually facilitate a lot of dialogue between citizen and state authorities, primarily following this kind of best practice of participatory governance for development that has become to dominate a lot of development contexts. And it's seen as a way of deepening the relationship and cooperation between citizens and authorities at the level of everyday communal life. And in Japan, the authorities very much adopted this approach for the recovery of these communities. And they called it a community-focused recovery, and the citizens and municipalities were very much placed in the center of that process, with the government clearly instructing local municipalities to establish forums where residents will be able to discuss the future of their communities that would respect the needs of local residents and duly reflect their various opinions. So there was a clear emphasis on dialogue there as well. And these are kind of the three, the relationship between the citizens and authorities, and then this process of dialogue are really kind of at the center of my paper. And the central question that I'm actually exploring is, how were people then able to tap into these processes of participatory governance to turn their imaginaries of alternative futures into tangible goals and realizable plans for the future? And as you can probably imagine, there's a lot of research done on participatory governance that is quite critical of it. And, even case studies kind of show that there's no consistency across participatory, projects and participatory development projects overall. So this obviously didn't happen in Japan. So So people were there was a lot of things going wrong with these kinds of forums as well. But I didn't want to just write a paper is like, oh, these forums don't work and people are unhappy, because there was also, because I felt that there was a lot of other things that were coming out of these forums, and I wanted to really try to explore in a little bit more depth what is actually happening in these spaces, and what is people's relationship with these kind of participatory spaces that are such a common feature of development context and these post-disaster contexts. So what is actually coming out of these? What are some of the results, rather than just saying that they don't work or they do work, but actually what are some of a little bit of a more nuanced kind of discussion about them. So there was a lot of, so as I said, there was a lot of these spaces that local municipalities then designated for this dialogue to take place between them and their residents in these municipalities. And the aim was very much to capture people's voices and understand their needs. A lot of these spaces, were town hall meetings or working groups, neighborhood association meetings, kind of even surveys and things like this that I've included into this as kind of spaces of dialogue that were institutionalized as part of the recovery process. And on top of that, I also then talk to people about what is their vision for the future. What do they actually want to happen as a result of this recovery? And then I also talked to some municipal authorities and civil servants, as well as read the government documents for, how, the plans for the recovery, the local municipal recovery plans as well. And what I found is that this vision that people had for the future was remarkably similar between the authorities and citizens, broadly framed as, a desire for a safer community so that these disasters don't impact people in the same way, especially because Japan is so prone to disasters, but also to overcome some of these socioeconomic challenges that these communities have and create more resilient communities in that respect. So in this way, people kind of wanted the same things. The authorities and the citizens wanted the same things in a very kind of broad way. But despite the volume of opportunities to express themselves, as well as these, corresponding points in the broad vision for the future, majority of local residents still felt quite dissatisfied with the process of recovery, and they were feeling voiceless. And a lot of them actually, phrased it in an identical way, saying that kimochi ga wakaranai. They don't understand how we feel. They don't understand what we need. They don't understand us, essentially. So that was kind of, an expression of voicelessness, and it was very empathetically actually usually uttered. But then what I found even more curious was actually that this kind of dissatisfaction and voicelessness was matched, the degree of voicelessness and dissatisfaction was actually matched with this intense optimism and hopefulness that people expressed for the future. So one of the questions that I often ask people is that, if you think 5 years in the future, what do you think that your community will be like? So not kind of imagine, what kind of like, what would you like for it to be like, but what do you think it will be like? And they painted this really optimistic image saying like, oh, well, our economy will be growing, we'll have more people here, people will return, and, we'll have nice communities and everyone will enjoy themselves, etc., etc. So very, very extremely positive. But then there was also this element of voicelessness that I found really, really curious. And I wanted to explore more in terms of what was actually happening there. So to start with the kind of the idea of voicelessness, so what I discovered, so I did actually participate in some of these spaces of dialogue and also talk to people who have participated in these spaces. And what I found is that majority of the dialogue that was actually taking place in these spaces was very restricted by the state and local level fiscal policies and legislation. So essentially the policies that were put in place to help this recovery move forward were actually restricting what people could actually discuss in these spaces. So a lot of the times the government said like, okay, well, these are the solutions that, we can finance. So pick one, essentially. So that already restricted the kinds of discussions that can be had in these spaces. And a lot of the times these plans didn't actually then correspond with the lived experience of people on the ground. And in the paper, I have this experience, have this example of the tsunami walls. So the government in many communities came and said like, okay, we're going to build a tsunami wall to make your community safer. But actually what the local residents were trying to say is that no, the tsunami wall is not going to make us safer. It's going to actually do the opposite. It's going to make our communities less safe. Okay, all right. Well, okay, sorry. Okay. So anyway, so this was kind of, so what could be discussed in these spaces was very limited. But then also if we look at this, so where does the hope then come from? So what I've kind of argue in the paper is that, that these institutional, legislative and fiscal structures that were imposed upon these dialogues, they were narrowing and fixing these communities onto a very specific trajectory. And by doing that, the government was also making a promise that they deliver what they have outlined in this trajectory and in their plans and in their imaginaries. So, but because this fulfillment of that promise can only be viewed from the future, the only thing that it left people to do is actually, okay, well, we can just hope that the government actually delivers on this promise. And that's where I kind of argue is that the element of hope came from and gave people momentum to hope for a better future, stay optimistic, etc., etc. But in my discussion part, then I explained that, you know, this optimism turns cruel when actually people attach their optimism to patterns of kind of behavior and patterns of change that don't actually deliver on the aspirations that they have. So a lot of the times in Tohoku, for instance, they're attaching their optimism to these patterns of like revitalization policies and a lot of these kind of economic change and, you know, repopulation, et cetera, that are actually quite impossible for Japan to realize because of a lot of national issues that they have in terms of their population declining, overall population declining, for instance, and the economy largely being quite stagnant. So actually being able to deliver on these promises is quite impossible, which leads to this optimism of people being quite cruel in nature. So then finally, just how do we then move forward from this? So some of the conclusions that I make is that despite these spaces actually failing to duly reflect their various opinions of local residents, I still argue that the participatory spaces are still the best avenue for achieving democratic decision-making and inducing dialogue. So they're not forms of tyranny as some other authors and researchers have suggested. But the problem is not whether we have participatory spaces, but what actually happens and the shape of dialogue that happens in these. So despite offering this hopeful momentum, I argue that the hope was ultimately silencing for people because it stemmed from the lack of opportunities for people to explain the shape of their local issues to the authorities. And I argue that this is then actually what we should be doing in these spaces of dialogue, is that people actually outline what is the shape of their problems and how they should be solved, rather than just used as venues for simply government to promise a better future. So those are the conclusions that I have. And so just finally, thank you very much for listening.